So there I was in that little bookstore on 5th Street, reaching for this romance novel that everyone at work kept raving about. And this hand bumps into mine going for the exact same book. I look up and there's DeAndre with this goofy smile, all apologetic and charming, insisting I should take it since I grabbed it first, which wasn't even true. But whatever, he was cute enough, tall, nice eyes, dressed like he actually gave a damn about his appearance. Most guys I'd been meeting lately looked like they rolled out of bed and threw on whatever was lying on their floor. We ended up talking for like an hour right there in the romance section, which should have been embarrassing, but somehow wasn't. He had this way of listening that made me feel like I was the most interesting person he'd ever met, asking follow-up questions about my job in communications, and actually remembering details when I mentioned my college roommate's wedding disaster. When he asked for my number, I was honestly impressed by how smooth he was about it. None of that awkward fumbling around that most guys do. Our first real date was at this Italian place downtown, and I have to admit, DeAndre knew how to treat a woman right. Opened doors, pulled out my chair, asked what I wanted to drink before ordering his own. All that old school gentleman stuff that you don't see much anymore. He told me about his work in project management, how he was saving up to buy a house, his plans for the future. Very responsible, very stable, very much the kind of guy you could build something real with. I trained him well. Even from the beginning, the next 3 years flew by faster than I expected. DeAndre was everything you could want in a boyfriend. Reliable, funny when he wasn't being too serious, driven enough to get promoted twice while we were dating. He remembered anniversaries, brought me flowers for no reason, supported my career goals even when I wasn't sure what those goals actually were. When he proposed, it was exactly the kind of romantic gesture I'd always pictured. Sunset dinner, down on one knee, ring that actually fit my style instead of some generic diamond monstrosity. Our wedding in 2018 was honestly perfect. Nothing too fancy, just our families and close friends. But DeAndre handled most of the planning because he said he wanted me to actually enjoy our engagement instead of stressing over centerpiece colors. His mom cried during the ceremony. My sister gave this speech about how she'd never seen me happier. And DeAndre looked at me during our vows like I was some kind of goddess. Everything felt exactly like it was supposed to feel. The first couple years of marriage were pretty great. I'll give him that. We traveled to Mexico and Colorado, had game nights with other couples, developed all these little routines that made us feel like a real team. DeAndre would bring me coffee in bed every Saturday morning, always made exactly the way I liked it with that expensive creamer I preferred. He'd leave these encouraging notes in my lunch when I was stressed about work presentations. Stupid little things like, "You've got this," beautiful, that honestly did make me feel better. But after a while, all those sweet gestures started feeling more like obligations than romance. Like he was checking boxes on his good husband list instead of actually thinking about what I needed. The Saturday morning coffee became this routine where he'd stand there waiting for me to thank him, and the encouraging notes felt generic after you'd read 50 of them. I started noticing annoying things, how he'd leave his socks right next to the hamper instead of in it, how he'd get so focused on work calls that he'd barely acknowledge me when I walked in the room. The worst part was how he'd get all proud of himself for doing basic relationship maintenance. When I didn't get that promotion I'd been hoping for. He bought a consolation cake and acted like that fixed everything. "I believe in you more than you believe in yourself," he said, which sounds nice, until you realize it's basically calling you insecure. And he'd always want to talk through problems instead of just letting things go, turning every minor disagreement into some deep relationship analysis session. I started feeling invisible in my own marriage. DeAndre would come home and immediately start talking about his day, his projects, his office drama, barely asking about mine unless I forced the conversation that direction. We'd go to dinner and he'd spend half the time checking work emails, apologizing but doing it anyway. The man who used to hang on my every word was treating me like background noise in his perfectly organized life. That's when I downloaded Hinge. Not because I was planning anything serious, just because I missed feeling wanted and appreciated. Is that really so terrible? I deserve to have someone pay attention to me. Someone who got excited about talking to me instead of treating me like another item on their daily schedule. The app was just for validation, proof that I was still attractive and interesting to people who didn't take me for granted. Dylan's profile caught my attention immediately. He was good-looking in that slightly dangerous way, not pretty boy perfect like DeAndre, but rugged and confident. His photos showed him at concerts, traveling, actually living his life instead of just working and sleeping. When we matched, His first message was clever and flirty. Nothing like the boring, hey beautiful crap most guys send. We started messaging every day. And he actually listened when I complained about work or shared funny stories about my friends. The conversations with Dylan felt electric in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He'd send good morning texts that made me smile, ask about things I'd mentioned days earlier, share inside jokes that made me laugh out loud at my desk. DeAndre would see me grinning at my phone and ask what was funny. And I'd make up some story about work group chats or my sister's dating disasters. The lying came easier than I expected. After a few weeks of messaging, Dylan suggested we meet for drinks. My stomach did this little flip when I saw his message. And I found myself saying yes before I'd really thought it through. It wasn't cheating. Technically, we were just going to talk in person instead of through the app. People meet new friends all the time. When DeAndre asked where I was going that Thursday evening, I told him I was meeting a work friend who needed advice about her boyfriend. He just nodded and went back to his laptop. The bar Dylan picked was downtown, dimly lit and intimate in a way that made everything feel more exciting. He looked even better in person, and the way he looked at me made me remember what it felt like to be desired instead of just appreciated. We talked for hours about everything: travel, music, books, dreams we'd given up on. He listened like every word mattered, made me feel witty and interesting and alive in a way I hadn't felt in months. When Dylan walked me to my car, there was this moment where we both knew something was going to happen. The kiss was soft at first, then deeper, and I felt this rush of guilt and excitement that made my head spin. I drove home with my lips still tingling, replaying every moment of the evening. DeAndre was already asleep when I got back, and I lay there next to him feeling like I was living two completely different lives. The guilt faded faster than I expected. Dylan and I kept messaging, kept meeting for lunch dates and after-work drinks. He made me feel special in a way that DeAndre used to, but didn't anymore. This was what I'd been missing. Someone who chose to spend time with me instead of just going through the motions of marriage. Someone who saw me as exciting instead of familiar. One evening, DeAndre and I were doing dishes after another quiet dinner where he'd spent most of the time talking about some project deadline. I was only half listening when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked, "Where are you really going on all these work friend meetings?" The question caught me completely off guard, and "What do you mean?" I asked, but he was already holding out his hand. "Can I see your phone?" My heart started pounding, but I tried to play it cool. "Are you serious right now? You want to go through my phone like some paranoid boyfriend?" But DeAndre wasn't backing down, and his expression was more serious than I'd seen in years. When I finally handed it over, he found the Hinge app within seconds. The look on his face was this mixture of confusion and sadness that honestly made me feel worse than if he'd started yelling. "What is this?" "Shantae," he asked, and his voice was so quiet I could barely hear him. I started explaining that it was just for fun, just for talking to people, nothing serious. But he was scrolling through my conversations with Dylan. Reading messages I'd forgotten were that flirty. "You've been meeting him," he said. And it wasn't a question. I wanted to deny it. But the evidence was right there in black and white. DeAndre sat down at our kitchen table with my phone still in his hands, and for a few minutes he didn't say anything at all. Then he looked up at me and said, "I thought we were happy. I thought you were happy," which was exactly the kind of dramatic reaction I'd been expecting. "We are happy." I told him, "This doesn't mean anything. I'm not doing anything wrong." But even as I said it, I knew how it sounded. That night, DeAndre hugged me before we went to sleep, and I could tell he was trying to move past what he'd found. He wanted to believe my explanation that it was just harmless flirting, that it didn't mean our marriage was in trouble. But I could also tell he was going to be watching me more closely, paying attention to things he'd been ignoring. The easy trust we'd had was gone, and honestly, that felt more like his problem than mine. I should have stopped messaging Dylan after that. Any reasonable person would have deleted the app and focused on fixing things with their husband. But DeAndre's reaction had actually made me more resentful, not less. He'd violated my privacy, made me feel like a criminal for having conversations with another adult. And Dylan was still there, still interested, still making me feel alive in a way that DeAndre never could. A few weeks later, I was home during my lunch break when Dylan texted asking if I wanted company. DeAndre was supposed to be at work until at least 6, and the house felt empty and boring before I could talk myself out of it. I told Dylan to come over. It felt dangerous and exciting in a way that reminded me why I'd been drawn to him in the first place. We ended up in my bedroom, and for the first time in months, I felt completely present in my own life. Dylan made me feel beautiful and wanted and reckless. Everything that marriage had slowly drained out of me. afterwards, lying there in the bed I shared with DeAndre. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt more like myself than I had in years. That's when I heard the front door slam. DeAndre's voice echoed through the house, calling my name, and my blood turned to ice. Dylan was already grabbing his clothes, moving faster than I'd ever seen anyone move. I threw on a robe and tried to think of some explanation, some way to make this look like anything other than what it obviously was. But when DeAndre appeared in our bedroom doorway and saw Dylan pulling on his shirt, there was no explaining anything. The sound DeAndre made wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a roar, but something in between that made my whole body freeze. He went after Dylan like he was trying to kill him, throwing punches and screaming words I'd never heard him use before. Dylan managed to get past him and ran out of the house half-dressed, leaving me alone with my husband, who was crying and shaking and looking at me like he'd never seen me before. "I was never enough for you, was I?" DeAndre asked, and his voice was so broken it barely sounded human. He locked himself in our guest bedroom and wouldn't come out, wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't listen when I tried to explain that this wasn't about him not being enough. But what was I supposed to say? That I'd been bored, that I'd needed excitement, that our perfectly good marriage wasn't enough to keep me interested. Within a week, DeAndre had moved out and filed for divorce. He wouldn't speak to me directly, only through lawyers, and made it clear that he wanted this over as quickly as possible. The house felt enormous and empty without him, and I kept expecting him to come back, to want to work things out like married couples do. But apparently, finding your wife in bed with another man is one of those lines you can't uncross. The consequences started piling up faster than I could handle them. My company had a strict no-tolerance policy for workplace affairs. And when someone recognized Dylan from the office building and reported both of us, we were both fired within days. Dylan stopped answering my texts after that, sending one final message that said, "I hope things get better for you," before disappearing completely. Apparently, when things got complicated, his interest in me evaporated. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. DeAndre paid me a lump sum for alimony just so he wouldn't have to deal with ongoing payments, wouldn't have to maintain any connection to me at all. I used the money to move into a studio apartment across town, all I could afford without a steady job, and blew through most of the rest on furniture and clothes and dinners out because sitting alone in that tiny space was too depressing. Now, 8 months later, I'm working part-time at a furniture store with people who think discussing their weekend plans counts as stimulating conversation. My communications degree is basically worthless since I can't get references from my last job. And the gap in my employment history makes every interview awkward. I've stopped talking to most of our mutual friends because the whole situation is too embarrassing to explain. And my family alternates between disappointment and pity depending on their mood. DeAndre's sister sent me a message a few months ago saying she missed me and hoped I was doing okay, which honestly just made everything worse. His whole family had welcomed me like I was their own daughter. And now they probably think I'm some kind of heartless cheater who threw away the best thing that ever happened to her, which isn't fair because relationships are complicated and people make mistakes and everyone acts like I'm the first person who ever got bored in a marriage. My therapist keeps talking about emotional immaturity and taking accountability for my choices. But what's the point of dwelling on things that are already done? I made decisions that seemed right at the time based on what I was feeling and what I needed. Maybe they weren't perfect decisions, but I'm not some calculating villain who set out to destroy everything good in my life. I was just trying to feel alive again, trying to find some excitement in a life that had become predictable and routine. The worst part is how everyone expects me to be devastated, to spend my days crying over what I lost. And yeah, I miss certain things about being married. The financial security, having someone to come home to, the way DeAndre used to make me feel safe and cared for. But I also remember feeling trapped and invisible. Remember the way he'd take me for granted and assume I'd always be there no matter how little attention he paid me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if DeAndre had come home an hour later that day, if Dylan and I had finished what we were doing, and he'd left before anyone found out. Would we have kept seeing each other? Would I have eventually left DeAndre for him? Or would the excitement have faded once the secrecy was gone? Once Dylan realized I came with actual baggage and responsibilities, instead of just being a fun distraction, I'll never know. Because Dylan showed his true colors the minute things got messy. All that charm and attention disappeared the second there were real consequences. The second I needed actual support instead of just validation. He talked a good game about connection and chemistry. But when push came to shove, he ran out of my house half-dressed and never looked back. The loneliness is the hardest part now. Not just being alone, but being alone with everyone knowing why. When I go to the grocery store or out to dinner by myself, I wonder if people can tell just by looking at me that I'm divorced, that I effed up my life so spectacularly that I went from having everything to having nothing in the span of a few months. The studio apartment is quiet in a way that makes me want to scream sometimes, especially on Saturday mornings when I remember how DeAndre used to bring me coffee in bed. I've tried dating again, but it's harder than I expected. Men my age are either recently divorced themselves and bitter about it, or they've never been married and can't relate to what I've been through. When they ask about my last relationship, I never know what to say. That I was married for years to a good man who loved me, but I threw it away because I was bored. That I had everything most women want, but it wasn't enough to keep me interested. The truth is, I don't regret everything that happened. I regret getting caught, regret the way things ended, regret losing the security and stability that came with being married to DeAndre's. But I don't regret feeling alive again, feeling desired and exciting and worth pursuing. For those few months with Dylan, I remembered who I used to be before I became someone's wife, before my life became about Saturday morning coffee and anniversary dinners at the same restaurant. Maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe that makes me the kind of person who can't appreciate what they have until it's gone. But I'm not going to pretend I was completely wrong about everything. That DeAndre was perfect, and I was some kind of monster who destroyed paradise. Marriage is hard work, and sometimes people grow apart, and sometimes you need more than just stability and routine to feel fulfilled. I'm not proud of how things ended, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for wanting more than what I had. DeAndre deserved better than someone who felt trapped in their marriage, and I deserved better than feeling invisible in my own life. Maybe we both got what we needed in the end, even if it wasn't what either of us planned. The furniture store job isn't permanent. The studio apartment won't be forever. And eventually, I'll figure out how to build a life that feels authentic instead of just safe, exciting instead of just comfortable. I learned that I can't settle for good enough anymore. Can't pretend to be satisfied with less than what makes me feel truly alive. That has to count for something, even if nobody else understands it.